please welcome John Whitacker. So we're going to jump right in. We don't have too much time, so we've been having some great conversations in the back. We'll try to cover as much as we did back there. We don't have to address the whole crisis. We've already touched on that enough today. Wanted to get right into giving your broad understanding of how I would say the trajectory of understanding inside the Biden campaign around these plans that are supporting farmers towards regenerative agriculture. So giving our audience here and our audience online a little more perspective of what in terms of the understanding inside the campaign and for the planning has emerged in the last year around the potential of regenerative agriculture, and what are you seeing now, the commitment of the campaign on a whole scale?
One of the key points in that is the CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program. And I'm going to pick on that one particularly because it takes a little while when you're trying to rebuild soil health. It's one of those things that as you start into no-till and start into cover crops, it takes a little time for the biology to build back. And I understand this because my dad started with no-till in 1978 while I was still at college. And we have been working with that system for a long, long time now. The soil changes. And I was particularly intrigued when you mentioned Gabe Brown and the infiltration rate. Infiltration rate greatly increases, water infiltration, and that's so important to us. But it takes that time, and while a producer is learning, they need something to support them. After about 5 years, which is the length of the CSP program, if you sign that conservation stewardship contract, after about 5 years, the soil biology is such that you begin to lower the purchased inputs, such as fertilizers, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. Phosphorus may be quicker in the decline than nitrogen. And that's a big difference because it is, as you say, as Gabe Brown says, then you're signing the back of the check, not the front of the check.
Exactly. So in terms of looking at starting with that reality that farmers are in, especially when we can jump right to this situation where the companies that are selling the seeds, the companies that are selling the fertilizers and the herbicides and pesticides, their profits are skyrocketing, going up and up, and we're dealing with farmers on tighter and tighter margins. So just talk a little bit more about the Biden administration, what it would look like to start to have that benefit go towards the farmers, and saying, yes, we have some of these conservation stewardship programs, but what would be the additional up level of that? And I've read some of it in your plan, but I'd love to hear from you of what have you seen to say, we're going to go way further. We're going to take this bigger, and we're going to make sure it applies to more, or more farmers see it as an incentive program.
One of the key points there is in research. So much of the research today is, personally I call it corporate research. We need public research. When I was at Iowa State, there was a lot of research going on new varieties, on how to. We need that how-to research, and that's one of the key components, is going back to public research that all of us as citizens own, that all of us as citizens benefit from. And having that again is one of the key ways that we benefit, in particular as farmers and as consumers.
On that question, it just brought up something else. A lot of us who are in the movement working with and honored to work with some of these pioneering farmers, yes to the public, 100%. I think most people are in support of that. And there's also an outcry of, can we get more support from the universities instead of them leading these projects? Because honestly, sometimes they don't know how to do it best. And sometimes those results aren't the best, and those recommendations for the farmers aren't the best. Because when we talk about context, so many times it's the farmers and the farmer trainers, the people who are actually farmers and then training other farmers, who can identify those slight shifts in context and train farmers inside of that, versus sometimes what comes out of the university public system can be siloed and can be subjective and doesn't necessarily have that open. So what would the Biden administration do to start inviting the expertise of these pioneering farmers into the fold of what the future of agriculture can be?
It's that whole theory again of public research. You look at what Iowa Learning Farms is doing, where they go out and hold field days,
Yeah.
and that's actually on a producer's farm, where that producer is looking at, say, it's a bioreactor, or they're doing cover crops,
Yeah.
and how cover crops and no-till in conjunction are building carbon.
Yeah.
And you also do that through another public entity of research, and that's the Agricultural Research Service, ARS, within USDA. And ARS now is showing us that by the combination of cover crops and no-till, we're actually storing about 200 pounds of carbon a year per acre on average. That's a significant amount of carbon that we bring out of the atmosphere and store as farmers.
Amazing. So we have a question here. It says, farm losses from flooding damages went past $2.9 billion in Iowa just this last year in 2019, and we now understand that healthy soil can substantially safeguard from these damages. So how would a Biden presidency help farmers make their farm climate disaster resilient types of policies and incentivize those? So particularly on the disaster resilience versus the let's fix it downstream, as we talked about earlier, what are those policies of saying, you know what, we're going to rebuild the function of this land so it works as a water catcher sponge versus putting up the money and having that money safeguard more on the back end? What's the way that that's going to go about?
I saw a unique article Thursday from InsideClimateNews.org. And they had looked at geospatial data, and they noticed that side-by-side farms, some of them, the water infiltrated more quickly than others in these flooded situations where there had been flooding and these losses. And yes, 2019, 19 million acres nationwide not planted because of flooding. So the effect was nationwide. It wasn't just in Iowa.
Of course, yeah.
The wettest year in the lower 48 states ever on record. But what they noticed from this geospatial data was side-by-side fields. One of them was drier than the other one. And so they went and they researched those fields, and what they found were long-term no-till, long-term cover crops. And so that's where it ties back to, we've got to be able to help producers take that 5-year step. Because it's just like planting a tree. When's the best time to plant a tree? Well,
20 years
10
ago.
years ago or 20 years ago. When's the best time to start no-till and cover crops? 5 years ago or now.
Yeah.
We need to help farmers get started now and then support them so that they can get that knowledge base of their own in their own operation and learn how to do it.
Yeah, it's music to my ears, and I hope to others as well. Regarding antitrust, the Biden campaign has stated it wants to strengthen enforcement of the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts and the Packers and Stockyards Act. What are the difficulties of making that happen, and how soon would farmers actually start to see any benefit from them, and what would those be?
The number one difficulty has been, and it was throughout the time that I was in USDA, was these things that get put into budget bills that say USDA cannot spend money on the following things. And it was always listing some of those little things that we wanted to do on Packers and Stockyards, Clayton Antitrust. Having that ability to actually take action, to write rules, and Congress not telling us, no, you can't do that, that's the number one key. That's the number one thing that stops us.
Can you give a little, just slight logistically, why that difference, just so our audience is aware of what that difference is?
What that means is that as a USDA official, my time is, anything that I do on my time is spending money on that issue. Mm-hmm. So I can't even talk about that issue then. When Congress says thou shalt not spend money writing, enforcing, or any of those rules,
right,
you can't do anything with it.
Right.
And that was the big stop to that.
Thank you. Next question is a bit more about, we kind of already covered it, so we might not need to, but you had made a note here about this 11 inches of rainfall, being able to take that type of thing. So I wanted to just kind of ask from the side of understanding the Biden campaign, and if you can speak directly, if you can, to his desire to empower American farmers to be a part of this big transformation, if you will, of how our land is and how secure our nation is because of it, from the risk management all the way to economics. Like, can you give a little taste to us of what the Biden campaign is feeling internally and him himself?
I think that comes in that pledge by the Biden campaign that we will be, by 2050, net zero emissions in agriculture. Agriculture will be a sink. That's what it's going to take.
Yeah.
And that's what that is. That's a commitment that is made by the Biden campaign, a Biden presidency, that we're setting a goal. We're setting a date that we're going to reach net zero. That's what that relates to.
Yeah.
Because that infiltration, it all ties back to clean water comes from healthy soil.
And healthy soil comes
And
from?
healthy soil comes from
Carbon.
cover crops, no-till, and taking care of the land.
Getting the carbon in the soil. All of a sudden you hit your climate goal, you also get the means of fixing all the issues. It's unbelievable.
I think back in an agronomy class that trying to remember back 40 plus years, and they ask all the students, okay, what are the 3 nutrients that every plant needs in the greatest quantities? And the students are all coming up with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. No one passed the quiz. Oxygen,
Water,
hydrogen, and
carbon. Yeah.
And those are the 3 that they need so much that they'll store them in the soil. That's what we get from a natural system such as cover crops and no-till.
Exactly. So that perfect segue to our next question: biodiversity and environmental health, as well as human health. So many of us remember 30 years ago when birds, bees, insects, wildlife, game, and fish were in much greater plenitude. Biodiversity is key for land function and land remaining fertile. Combining that with the onslaught of diseases that humans are now being affected by, and now the evidence building of we are literally poisoning ourselves, like it or not. That's happening all over the country. Coming from environmental health and what biodiversity means from the ground up, from those, over 6 billion microbes in a teaspoon of healthy soil, all the way up to how we're being affected by our current regime, and then what would happen if we transformed that. So take us on a journey in your mind of what's possible with the biodiversity, environmental health, and human health.
One of the things in that, the key word in my opinion is diversity. When nature, when the prairies were developed, there were millions of seeds, but there were more than one species.
Yeah.
There were hundreds of species of prairie plants out there, and they all had their purpose. Some of them were deep tap-rooted so that they would bring nutrients up. Some of them were collecting more carbon for those deep tap-rooted plants to use. And some years one would flourish, and other years another would flourish. Having that diversity out there in our production systems helps all of us be healthier. And it really particularly helps the wildlife.
Yeah.
Really particularly helps the wildlife and helps the pollinators.
And just, we don't have enough time to talk about, but you were talking about being witness to farms that are essentially becoming logged by the government as sanctuaries for animals, because the farms became the only place in that area that we're allowing for biodiversity and therefore bigger fauna to emerge. Our last question, we have to be quick on this one, is national security. So obviously, as the world is having its own major conflicts and interest and diversions, what do you see, and do you think that the Biden administration takes seriously enough the state of emergency, or whatever you want to call it, of how close to the brink we are, how fast our resource, 4 tons of topsoil per acre per year being lost? Do you think, and to this audience, would you think that the Biden administration would be taking seriously enough in the first 4 years of this is a #1 priority for our national security. Like, quite literally, all the things that we need to operate as a nation do come down to food and water security and land working.
What Vice President Biden has said, the existential issue of our day. And that's what this is, the existential issue of our day. And the reason is, you know, we're a secure nation in large part because we're food secure.
Yeah.
We're also a secure nation in large part because we're clean water secure right now.
Yeah.
But we have to remember clean water comes from healthy soil. If we want to be clean water secure in the future, we have to have healthy soil.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Let's give it up for John Whitaker. That was amazing. Thank you so much.